Sheriff, you really should think twice before you open that case. Calvin Richardson said it quietly, almost too quietly for the words to carry across the empty Virginia highway. Sheriff Jonathan Mercer stared at him through the open driver's side window, one hand resting against the door of his patrol SUV. It was just after 10:30 p.m., and the road was nearly empty beneath the pale glow of the streetlights. Behind Calvin sat a black SUV, spotless and expensive-looking, its headlights still illuminating the pavement ahead. Calvin remained behind the wheel, dressed in a navy suit, white shirt, and dark blue tie. He looked like a man coming home from an important meeting, not someone who had just been pulled over by a county sheriff. Mercer glanced at Calvin's face, then at the vehicle, then back at Calvin. "Step out of the SUV," he ordered. Calvin did not argue. He simply reached for his wallet and handed over his driver's license. "Sheriff, may I ask why I was stopped?" Mercer barely looked at the license before answering. "Your vehicle caught my attention." Calvin waited. "Was I speeding?" "No." "Did I violate a traffic law?" Mercer's expression tightened. "I asked you to step out." Calvin slowly placed both hands where they could be seen. His voice remained calm. "I understand. I'm simply trying to understand what's happening." A second patrol vehicle pulled in behind them. Deputy Andrew Foster stepped out and approached carefully, his eyes moving from Mercer to Calvin and then to the SUV. He noticed something immediately. Calvin was unusually composed. No shouting, no arguing, no sudden movements, just quiet patience. Mercer, however, seemed increasingly determined to find a reason for the stop. "Open the rear door," he said. Calvin looked at him. "Why?" Mercer gave a thin smile. "Because I want to know what's inside." For a moment, the highway seemed completely silent. Even Andrew hesitated. Calvin looked toward the patrol vehicle, where the dashboard camera was still recording. Then he looked back at Mercer. "Sheriff, are you sure you want to do this?" Mercer laughed softly. "Do what?" Calvin's eyes remained steady. "Turn a traffic stop into something else." Mercer stepped closer to the SUV and pointed toward the rear compartment. "Open it." Calvin finally stepped out. He adjusted the sleeve of his navy jacket and stood beside the vehicle, calm beneath the cold white light. Mercer opened the rear door. Inside were several ordinary items: a garment bag, a leather briefcase, a travel folder, and a small black case secured beneath the floor compartment. Mercer noticed the case immediately. His expression changed. "What's that?" Calvin said nothing for a moment. Then he answered, "Something you probably shouldn't open." Mercer looked at Andrew. Then he looked back at Calvin. A slow smile crossed his face. "Now, I definitely want to see it." Calvin glanced once at the camera mounted on the patrol vehicle. He knew exactly what it was recording. And what Sheriff Jonathan Mercer did not know was that this traffic stop had already become part of an investigation that reached far beyond this quiet Virginia road. Asterisk, then you have nothing to hide, do you? Sheriff Jonathan Mercer asked, his eyes fixed on the black case inside Calvin Richardson's SUV. Calvin remained perfectly still, his expression calm beneath the harsh roadside lights. "That depends on what you mean by hide, Sheriff," he replied. Mercer gave a short laugh and motioned toward the rear compartment. "Open it." Calvin looked at him for several seconds before answering. "I would prefer that you explain the legal basis for searching it." The question seemed to irritate Mercer more than any refusal could have. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." Deputy Andrew Foster stood a few feet away, listening carefully. He had expected a routine traffic stop, but nothing about this situation felt routine anymore. Calvin had provided his license. He had answered every question. He had remained respectful from the beginning. Yet Mercer kept looking for another reason to continue. "Where are you coming from?" Mercer asked. "Richmond. Where are you headed?" "A hotel nearby." "Which hotel?" Calvin gave him the name. Mercer wrote it down, then looked at the SUV again. "And what's inside that case?" Calvin answered evenly. "Private documents." Mercer's eyebrows rose. "Private documents?" "Yes. Government documents?" Calvin paused. It was only half a second, but Andrew noticed it. "Some of them are sensitive," Calvin said. Mercer stepped closer to the rear of the SUV. "Sensitive to who?" Calvin looked directly at him. "That is not something I can discuss on the side of a highway." Mercer shook his head, as though Calvin had just confirmed his suspicion. "You know, people who cooperate usually don't make this difficult." Calvin's face remained composed. "I have cooperated. Not enough." The words hung in the air. Andrew glanced toward the dashboard camera in the patrol vehicle. The red recording light was still visible. He wondered why Mercer seemed so determined to continue. Then Mercer pointed toward the black case. "Open it." Calvin did not move. "Sheriff, I am asking you one more time to reconsider." Mercer's expression hardened. "And I'm telling you that I'm not asking." For the first time, Calvin looked past Mercer toward Andrew. Their eyes met briefly. Andrew could not explain it, but something about Calvin's expression made him uneasy. It was not fear. It was almost as if Calvin already knew how this would end. Mercer reached toward the case, but stopped when Calvin spoke again. "Deputy Foster." Andrew looked at him. "Yes, sir? Is your camera recording?" Andrew glanced toward the patrol vehicle. "Yes." Calvin nodded once. "Good." Mercer turned sharply. "Why did you ask him that?" Calvin looked back at him. "Because the truth matters." Mercer stared at him for a moment, then opened the case. Inside were neatly arranged folders, a sealed federal envelope, a secure phone, and an identification card placed face down. Mercer reached toward the card. Andrew took one step closer. Something about the moment felt different now. The traffic stop had started with a simple question about a vehicle. But within minutes, Sheriff Jonathan Mercer had moved far beyond the original reason for stopping Calvin Richardson. And as his fingers reached for that face-down identification card, he was about to discover that the man standing beside the SUV was not the person he thought he had pulled over. Sheriff Mercer had finally found the identification card he thought would prove his suspicion. But the name on it was about to change everything. Jonathan Mercer slowly lifted the card from the black case and turned it over, expecting to see the name of an unfamiliar businessman or perhaps some private security credential. Instead, his eyes stopped on the official seal. His expression changed almost instantly. Deputy Andrew Foster noticed it. "Sheriff?" he asked. Mercer did not answer. He looked at the card again, then at Calvin Richardson, who stood beside the SUV with the same quiet composure he had shown from the beginning. "What exactly is this?" Mercer asked. Calvin said nothing. Mercer held the card closer to the light. The federal seal was unmistakable, but the identification number and name were partially covered by his thumb. He moved his hand. Andrew could finally see the words. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Andrew's face tightened. He looked at Calvin, then back at Mercer. "Sheriff, maybe we should stop here." Mercer immediately lowered the card. "Why?" Andrew hesitated. "Because this may be a federal matter." Mercer shook his head. "I'll decide what this is." Calvin finally spoke. "That is exactly the problem." Mercer turned toward him. "What did you say?" "I said you may want to reconsider what you are doing." There was no anger in Calvin's voice. No threat, just certainty. Mercer looked down at the identification card again. Something about the situation was no longer adding up. The man in front of him was wearing a perfectly tailored Navy suit, carrying federal credentials and showing none of the nervousness Mercer had expected. Yet instead of stepping back, Mercer doubled down. "You never told me you were FBI." Calvin answered, "You never asked." Andrew looked toward the patrol vehicle again. The camera was still recording. Every word, every question, every decision. Mercer placed the identification card on top of the folders and reached for the sealed federal envelope. "And what's in this?" Calvin immediately said, "That envelope is sealed." Mercer stopped. "You don't give me orders." Calvin calmly replied, "I'm not giving you an order." He paused. "I'm giving you a warning." The silence that followed felt heavier than the cold night air. Andrew could sense that something much bigger was unfolding. Mercer, however, still believed he controlled the situation. He picked up the envelope and examined the markings. It carried a federal classification stamp and a case number. Mercer frowned. "What kind of investigation are you involved in?" Calvin looked directly at him. "The kind where evidence has a way of finding the right people." Mercer stared at him. "Are you accusing me of something?" "No," Calvin said. "Not yet." Andrew's eyes widened slightly. Mercer placed the envelope back down, but his confidence had begun to crack. He glanced at the SUV, then at the federal credentials, then at the camera recording everything behind him. For the first time that night, he seemed to understand that this was no longer a routine traffic stop. But neither Mercer nor Andrew knew the most important detail yet. Calvin Richardson had not come to Virginia by accident. He had come because someone inside the county had been hiding something for a very long time. And the evidence was sitting inside that SUV, waiting for the truth to catch up with them. What Sheriff Jonathan Mercer found inside that SUV was no longer just a question of what Calvin Richardson was carrying it. Was a question of why someone had gone to such extraordinary lengths to keep those documents hidden. Mercer stood beside the open rear door, staring at the sealed federal envelope as if it had suddenly become the most important object on the highway. Deputy Andrew Foster remained nearby, increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the stop. The roadside camera continued recording, its small red indicator glowing in the darkness. Calvin stood several feet away, his navy jacket perfectly straight, his white shirt bright beneath the streetlight, his dark tie still neatly in place. He looked almost untouched by the tension surrounding him. Mercer finally turned toward him. "You said you were traveling to a hotel." "That's correct." "For what?" "Business." "What kind of business?" Calvin paused. "Federal business." Mercer's jaw tightened. "That doesn't tell me anything." Calvin calmly replied, "It tells you enough to understand that you should stop searching without proper authority." Mercer ignored the warning. He picked up one of the folders and examined a label. There was no obvious name, only a case number and a federal reference code. Andrew leaned slightly forward. "Sheriff, maybe we should verify the credentials before going any further." Mercer looked at him sharply. "Are you questioning me?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting we verify everything." Calvin glanced at Andrew and gave a small nod. "That would be wise." Mercer opened another folder. Inside were copies of reports, photographs, and typed summaries. Nothing immediately revealed the full story, but several pages contained dates from the previous 6 months. Andrew noticed that every document seemed connected to the same county. "These are local cases," he said quietly. Calvin looked at him. "Some of them?" Mercer immediately closed the folder. "You're investigating our department?" Calvin did not answer. That silence seemed to tell Mercer more than words could have. "What gives you the right?" Mercer demanded. Calvin's expression remained calm. "The law." The answer landed heavily. Andrew looked between the two men. He was beginning to understand why Calvin had never seemed nervous. He had not been trying to convince Mercer of anything. He had simply been waiting for Mercer to reveal himself. Mercer stepped away from the SUV and looked down the empty highway. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then he noticed something else beneath the floor compartment. A thin black document pouch was secured beneath the luggage area. "What's that?" he asked. Calvin answered, "Evidence." Mercer looked at him. "Evidence of what?" Calvin said quietly, "That is what I came here to find out." Andrew felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. If Calvin was telling the truth, then this traffic stop had crossed into something far larger than a roadside investigation. Mercer slowly reached toward the pouch, then stopped. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in his expression. He looked at Calvin's federal identification again. Then he looked at the camera. Then at Andrew. Nobody spoke. Finally, Mercer asked the question that would change the entire night. "Who exactly are you, Mr. Richardson?" Calvin held his gaze for a long moment. "You'll know soon enough." And somewhere inside that black SUV was the answer, not only to Calvin's identity, but to a case that could expose what had been happening behind the closed doors of Jonathan Mercer's own department. Sheriff Mercer thought the black pouch would finally give him control of the situation, but he had no idea that the next document he touched could connect his own office to the investigation. Jonathan Mercer stared at the pouch beneath the floor compartment, then looked at Calvin Richardson. "You said this is evidence." Calvin nodded. "Yes. Evidence against who?" Calvin's expression remained calm. "That depends on what we find." Mercer did not like the answer. He crouched beside the SUV and carefully opened the pouch. Inside were several thin folders, each marked with a date, a case number, and a small federal reference code. Andrew Foster stepped closer, but Mercer immediately raised a hand. "Stay back." Andrew stopped. He could see enough to recognize that these were not ordinary documents. The first folder contained an internal report involving a traffic stop from 6 months earlier. The second referenced a missing evidence log. The third contained a complaint filed by a local resident. Mercer flipped through the pages, his confidence slowly fading. "Where did you get these?" he asked. Calvin answered, "They came from sources who believed the proper channels were not protecting them." Mercer looked up. "You're saying someone inside my department gave these to you?" "I'm saying people were willing to speak when they believed someone would finally listen." Andrew glanced at the paperwork. He recognized one of the case numbers. It belonged to a complaint he had seen months earlier. At the time, the report had been marked closed. "Sheriff," Andrew said quietly, "I remember that case." Mercer looked at him. "You shouldn't." Andrew frowned. "It was in the briefing files." Mercer closed the folder. "Then you remember the wrong case." Calvin watched the exchange without interrupting. That was when Andrew realized something important. Calvin was not asking questions because he lacked information. He was watching to see who already knew the answers. Mercer stood and held the folder against his side. "Mr. Richardson, I think you need to explain exactly what you're doing in my county." Calvin looked at him. "I'm following a trail. A trail leading where?" "To the truth." Mercer gave a frustrated sigh. "You keep talking like this is some kind of federal investigation." Calvin said nothing. Mercer stared at him. "Is it?" Calvin finally answered, "Yes." The single word changed the atmosphere. Andrew looked at Calvin again. Mercer slowly placed the folder back inside the pouch. Then he noticed another item beneath the documents. A secure phone. Its screen was dark, but a small notification light blinked once. Mercer reached toward it. Calvin spoke immediately. "I would leave that where it is." Mercer stopped. "Why?" "Because that phone contains information you are not authorized to access." Mercer stared at him. "And who decides that?" Calvin replied. The federal government. Another silence followed. Andrew looked toward the patrol vehicle and then back at Calvin. The camera was still recording. Every question, every answer, every decision. Mercer seemed to realize the same thing. He was no longer simply searching a vehicle. He was creating a record. Then the secure phone suddenly lit up. A single message appeared on the screen. Calvin glanced at it. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. Andrew saw the screen only for a second. 3 words were visible. We have enough. Mercer saw them too. His face went still. And for the first time that night, Sheriff Jonathan Mercer seemed to understand that the person he had pulled over was not merely carrying evidence. Calvin Richardson had been waiting for someone to reveal themselves. 6 hours before, Sheriff Jonathan Mercer stopped Calvin Richardson on that Virginia highway. Calvin had already seen the name Jonathan Mercer appear in a federal investigation file. At 4:18 that afternoon, Calvin sat alone in a quiet conference room inside a federal building in Richmond, Virginia, studying a stack of documents spread across a polished table. The room was almost silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system and the occasional sound of paper moving beneath his hand. He wore the same navy suit, white shirt, and dark blue tie he would later wear on the highway. But at that moment, there was nothing accidental about his presence there. Across the table sat Tasha Coleman, a senior FBI special agent who had spent months reviewing complaints connected to Mercer County. We have a pattern, Tasha said, sliding 3 folders toward him. Calvin opened the first. It contained a citizen complaint involving a traffic stop. The second involved missing evidence documentation. The third contained an internal report that appeared to have been closed without a complete review. Calvin studied each page carefully. Who signed the final reports? He asked. Tasha hesitated before answering. Jonathan Mercer. Calvin looked down at the documents again. Everyone? Not everyone, Tasha replied, but enough to make the pattern difficult to ignore. Calvin leaned back slightly. He had learned long ago that investigations were rarely solved by the loudest accusation. They were solved by details that refused to disappear. A missing time stamp. A changed report. A complaint that suddenly became inactive. A witness who said one thing and later found something different written in the official record. None of those details alone proved the whole story. Together, they demanded another question. Tasha placed a final document on the table. There's something else. Calvin looked at her. What? A former employee contacted us last night. He says there are records inside the sheriff's office that never made it into the official case files. Calvin's expression tightened. Can he identify them? Yes, but he won't hand them over remotely. Why? Because he believes someone is monitoring the department's internal systems. The room fell quiet. Calvin looked at the black secure phone beside his folder. Then he looked at the sealed envelope Tasha had prepared. So we go in person. Tasha nodded. That was my recommendation. Calvin stood and gathered the documents. No local notice? None. No advance contact with the sheriff's office? None. Calvin paused at the door. Good. Tasha looked at him. You know this could become complicated. Calvin gave a faint smile. It already is. Hours later, he would drive alone toward Mercer County in the black SUV. He would carry the federal documents, the secure phone, and the evidence pouch beneath the rear compartment. But there was one thing he did not know yet. Sheriff Jonathan Mercer was already watching for someone connected to the investigation. What Mercer did not know was that the person he was waiting for was not a junior investigator or an anonymous federal agent. It was the director of the FBI himself. And when Calvin's SUV appeared on that dark Virginia road, Mercer believed he had found an opportunity to take control of the situation. Instead, He had unknowingly driven straight into the federal investigation. The moment Jonathan Mercer saw the badge in Calvin Richardson's hand, the entire traffic stop changed, but the sheriff still had no idea that the worst discovery was waiting inside that black SUV. Mercer stared at the identification card for several seconds without speaking. The federal seal was clear beneath the roadside lights. The name was impossible to misunderstand. Calvin Richardson, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Andrew Foster stood nearby, watching his superior carefully. "Sheriff," Andrew said quietly, "we should verify the credentials." Mercer looked at him. "I know how to read an ID, Deputy." Andrew said nothing. Calvin remained beside the SUV, his posture relaxed, his hands visible. He did not seem interested in proving anything. He simply waited. Mercer looked back at the card. "You're telling me you're FBI?" Calvin answered, "No, the card is telling you." Andrew lowered his eyes, almost hiding a reaction. Mercer placed the identification card on the edge of the open case. "Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning?" Calvin looked at him calmly. "You never asked who I was." Mercer's expression tightened. "You could have avoided all of this." "I could have," Calvin replied. "But then we would never know what you would do." The sentence froze Andrew. Mercer stared at Calvin. What exactly is that supposed to mean? Calvin did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and removed a second identification card. He held it toward Andrew. "Deputy Foster, would you please read the title?" Andrew stepped closer. He looked down. His eyes widened. "Director." He stopped. Mercer immediately turned toward him. "What?" Andrew swallowed. "It says Director." Mercer took the card from him. His eyes moved across the identification. Then they stopped. "Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Calvin Richardson." The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire highway. Mercer looked at Calvin again, but the man in the navy suit had not changed. Same calm expression. Same steady posture. Same quiet confidence. Only now, the meaning of every earlier question was different. "You're the FBI director," Mercer said slowly. Calvin nodded once. "Yes." Andrew looked toward the SUV and then back at the open case. "Then what is all of this?" Calvin answered, "An investigation." Mercer's face became unreadable. "An investigation into what?" Calvin looked at the folders inside the case. "That depends on what we find." Mercer immediately glanced toward the black document pouch. "You've been investigating my department." Calvin did not deny it. "For several months." Andrew took a slow breath. He suddenly remembered the closed complaint he had seen earlier that year. The missing evidence report. The unusual changes in case records. The names that had disappeared from internal summaries. He looked at Mercer. "Sheriff." Mercer raised a hand. "Not now." Calvin watched the exchange quietly. Then his secure phone illuminated again. A new message appeared. Tasha Coleman had sent only one sentence. "We have confirmation. Proceed." Calvin read it and placed the phone back inside his jacket. Mercer noticed. "Who was that?" Calvin looked directly at him. "Someone you'll meet very soon." In the distance, another set of headlights appeared on the highway. Andrew turned toward them. Mercer did too. Several vehicles were approaching, moving steadily through the darkness. Calvin remained still. He already knew who was coming. Jonathan Mercer did not. And within minutes, the sheriff would finally discover what Calvin had been carrying in that SUV all along. The headlights coming down the highway were not there to help Sheriff Jonathan Mercer. They were there to take the case away from him. Mercer watched the vehicles approach, their white headlights growing brighter against the dark Virginia road. Andrew Foster stood beside him, silent now, while Calvin Richardson remained completely composed near the open SUV. The first vehicle stopped several yards behind the patrol cars. Tasha Coleman stepped out, followed by two federal investigators carrying official credentials and document cases. Mercer immediately recognized the significance of their arrival. "You called them," he said to Calvin. Calvin nodded. "Yes." Tasha walked toward the group, her expression professional and controlled. "Director Richardson." Calvin turned toward her. "Agent Coleman." Mercer looked between them. "You're telling me she works for you?" Tasha answered before Calvin could. "Yes, Sheriff. And we need you to step away from the vehicle." Mercer glanced toward the SUV. "Why?" Tasha looked at the open case, then at the federal envelope on top of the folders. "Because what is inside that vehicle is now part of a federal investigation." Mercer seemed unable to accept how quickly the situation had changed. Less than an hour earlier, he had believed he was conducting a routine roadside stop. Now federal investigators were standing on the same stretch of highway. And the man he had questioned was the director of the FBI. Andrew quietly stepped away from Mercer and moved toward Tasha. "Agent Coleman, I saw the documents." Tasha nodded. "Then you understand why we're here." She opened one of the federal document cases and removed a sealed folder. These records were collected from multiple sources. They concerned missing evidence logs, altered reports, and complaints that were closed without complete review. Mercer shook his head. "That doesn't prove anything." Calvin looked at him. "You're right," Mercer paused. "What?" Calvin continued. "A collection of documents is not the whole story." He reached into the SUV and carefully removed the secure phone. "This is." He handed it to Tasha. She activated the device and opened a recorded file. The screen displayed a timestamp from 3 weeks earlier. Mercer recognized the location immediately. It was inside the sheriff's office. His expression changed. Andrew looked at the screen, then at Mercer. "Sheriff, is that your office?" Mercer did not answer. Tasha played the recording. The audio captured a conversation about a case file that had later disappeared from the official record. No threats. No dramatic confrontation. Just voices discussing what should and should not appear in a report. The evidence was quiet, precise, and difficult to explain away. Calvin watched Mercer carefully. "This is why I came here personally." Mercer looked toward the SUV. "You planned this entire thing?" Calvin answered, "I planned to find the truth." Tasha closed the folder. "And tonight, we found another piece of it." Andrew looked at the patrol vehicle's camera. The entire stop was recorded too. Tasha nodded. "We know." Mercer suddenly understood. Every question, every demand, every search, every word spoken beside that SUV had become part of the evidence. Calvin adjusted his navy jacket and looked at the sheriff one final time. "You thought you were searching my vehicle," he said calmly. But the real search was already underway. Tasha turned toward the federal vehicles. The investigation would continue, but the balance of power had already changed. And inside that SUV was one final document that would connect everything together. When Tasha opened it, even Andrew Foster would finally understand why Calvin Richardson had chosen to drive into Mercer County alone. The sheriff thought the night had ended when the federal agents arrived. But the final document inside Calvin Richardson's SUV was about to reveal why he had come to Virginia in the first place. Tasha Coleman carefully opened the last folder from the black document pouch. Everyone became silent. Andrew Foster stood nearby, watching the pages as Tasha placed them one by one on the hood of the SUV. The first page contained a case number. The second contained a timeline. The third contained a list of names and dates connected to complaints that had never received a complete review. Then Tasha placed one final page on top. Jonathan Mercer looked at it and immediately recognized his own signature. "That cannot be right," he said. Tasha calmly replied, "We verified it twice." Mercer stared at the document. It showed that a report connected to an earlier complaint had been changed after it was officially submitted. The modification had not been authorized through the normal process. Andrew looked over the page and recognized the case. "I remember this," he said quietly. Mercer turned toward him. "You were not involved in that investigation." Andrew hesitated. "No, Sheriff. But I saw the original report." The silence that followed said more than anyone needed to explain. Calvin finally stepped forward. "That is why I came here personally." Mercer looked at him. "You already knew about the reports." Calvin nodded. "We knew enough to ask questions. We did not know enough to make conclusions." Tasha added, "Tonight changed that." She pointed toward the patrol vehicle. "The recording from this stop will be added to the evidence file." Mercer looked toward the camera. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his own decisions had become part of the investigation. Calvin had not needed to argue with him. He had not needed to threaten him. He had simply allowed the sheriff to make his own choices while everything was being recorded. Andrew looked at Calvin. "Director Richardson, why did you let him search the SUV?" Calvin looked at him calmly. "Because sometimes the most important evidence is not what someone finds. It is what they choose to do when they believe no one is watching." Tasha nodded. And tonight, everyone was watching. Mercer lowered his eyes. His authority on that stretch of highway had disappeared without a single dramatic confrontation. The federal investigators began collecting the documents according to procedure. The secure phone was placed into an evidence container. The folders were carefully organized. The patrol camera footage was preserved. Every detail had a place. Every action had a record. Calvin closed the rear door of the SUV and adjusted his navy tie. Andrew watched him. "What happens now?" Calvin answered, "The investigation continues." "And Sheriff Mercer?" Calvin paused. "He will have the same rights and responsibilities as anyone else under investigation." There was no celebration in Calvin's voice. No anger, only certainty. Tasha approached him. "Are you ready to leave?" Calvin nodded. Before getting into the SUV, he looked back at the highway where the entire encounter had begun. "A badge is supposed to represent responsibility," he said quietly. "It should never become permission to judge someone before knowing the truth." Then Calvin stepped into the SUV and closed the door. The vehicle pulled away from the roadside and disappeared into the Virginia night. Andrew remained behind, staring at the empty road. Sheriff Jonathan Mercer stood beside his patrol vehicle, silent and thoughtful, while the federal team continued its work. He had believed he was searching a stranger's SUV. In the end, the search had uncovered something much bigger, a trail of unanswered questions that could no longer be ignored. And that was the lesson Calvin Richardson left behind that night. When power forgets accountability, truth eventually becomes the evidence.
Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.